Always strange, but welcome. I'm honored to be here. Historical Society does wonderful things, preserving Biddeford history, and they have great volunteers. It's all really volunteer-based, so, whenever you see an event, it's great to support them. So, some of you have heard stories, some of you haven't. I've got a variety of friends here from the gym, and my husband came despite the Phillies are on. He's a Phillies fan. Laura's another friend, so it's great to welcome you, and I promised I would tell stories to make you cry, make you laugh, bit of journalism, bit about my books, and then I'll save time for Q&A, because I always want to hear your questions and what you want to know, and being a journalist for 35 plus years, you can ask me anything. But, to start with, I grew up in southern New Hampshire, and one of 6 girls. My dad wanted a boy and twins at the end, so he, ended up with 6 of us, and spoiled. He was like the king of the house. But, I grew up shy. My mother talked about me never saying a word till I was, in high school. And that's not exactly true, but I was shy and an observer at an early age. Used to write poetry, 12-page letters to my uncle, and he'd be like, this girl is just way too, she needs more things to do in her life. But I was a writer, and I used to write stories like Stephen King type things, my sister's stuffed animals coming alive, and, setting their bedroom on fire, and they're like, oh my God, what's wrong with her? But my high school teachers said, you're a writer, you have a gift, you need to pursue writing. And of course, being in high school, you're like, what do I do with writing? And they said, well, you could pursue journalism. So I went to UNH, graduated with photography and, journalism. And of course, while I was at UNH, and I know there's a young person back there, and all of us can have this lesson, but, deadlines were never my thing, and they still aren't. There's many editors who would probably still curse me because I would push it to the absolute last minute because I wanted more detail, more of my stories. But this was back in the day when there were typewriters, no phones, no internet, and I'm working on my magazine piece for my college magazine writing course. And of course, I'm staying up all night typing and rewriting and putting white out, and finally decide to hand it in. And I meet my professor, and he said, I have to give you an F for the course. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, Barbara, the grades are closed. And I was just devastated. And I always had a camera around my neck because I did photography constantly too. And he said, maybe you ought to, think more about photography than being a journalist. And I walked out of that room just devastated and went to the UNH railroad tracks, not wanting to jump in front of a train, but that's where people went, they walked, it was the college woods, and I just was devastated and, called my dad later that night, and I said, I got an F, and I'm gonna have to retype the class, and he said, I'm not a writer. And my dad, who has since passed, and being Irish, there'll be tears from me tonight, more than from you. But, my dad said, you have a gift, and you're a writer. And so I retook that class. I forget what I got, but I got a better grade than an F. Graduated, and of course, had deadline phobia because I was so afraid that I wasn't going to be able to make deadlines. So of course, I did what any good Irish girl did. I went with a backpack and $1,000 in '81 to Ireland, and I told my parents, I'll see you in a year. And they looked at me like, yeah, okay, not, thinking we'll see you in a month. I stayed a year. I worked for the Galway Advertiser as photographer, and of course they thought I was crazy because the Irish photographers were more mellow, but here you got a Yank running all over the place, photographing parades, and very aggressive photographer. But I mostly did photography for a year over there, and then I came back to the States, which made my mother happy. That was back in the day when you couldn't call, there's no internet. So I come back, worked at a weekly in my hometown of Pelham, New Hampshire, and I was doing the typical selectman stories, small town politics. And then the Lawrence Eagle Tribune called and said, hey, we need a reporter to cover some New Hampshire towns. And I thought, oh, I'm not interested. I'm trying to help this weekly paper better. My friends were like, what are you, nuts? Go to that paper. So the Lawrence Eagle Tribune is in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And a few years later, I was put on a story. I was 27 at the time. And you're all old enough, probably, to remember this. Willie Horton, or as we read about William Horton Jr. So we learned that Horton escaped from maximum security prison in 87. And it was a big surprise because Horton was sent away for life without parole. He had killed Joey Fournier, who was a 17-year-old gas station attendant in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And Joey handed over the money, but Horton and his two buddies stabbed Joey multiple times, like I want to say 28, and put his body in a trash can. So Horton and his two friends were sentenced to life without parole. So they're sentenced to, Walpole prison. Don't know if you've ever been there. Hopefully not sentenced, but I used to go to a lot of prisons, and it's got the guard towers, the wire, and so we're thinking, how did Horton get out of that prison? And then we learned he was on a weekend furlough, unsupervised, and won a lottery ticket and decided, I'm not going back to prison. And who blames him? And then we learned, after much, many months of reporting on the story, because obviously Massachusetts Department of Corrections wasn't eager to talk about this, because Horton ended up in Maryland, where he held a young couple hostage, raped the woman twice, put her fiance up in the wall, tied him up, slashed him, and they would have died, but they escaped. So we learned, here's Horton, out on a weekend pass, unsupervised, goes to Maryland, and didn't have to do this. I mean, it just showed his mentality because he stalked them, and I do believe he would have killed them both, but they get away. So we start learning, well, if Horton can get out on a weekend furlough, unsupervised, who else is getting out? And what is this program? But the Department of Corrections wanted nothing to do with us, so they were just kind of typical, some government agencies, they would just say, we're never going to talk to you, no comment. But we kept going. They kept saying, Massachusetts furlough program is similar to many other states in the country. So I called the federal government, and after 20 calls, they're like, we don't know what each state has a furlough program. So I called every state in the country, and I learned Massachusetts was the only state letting killers and rapists out unsupervised on the weekend. And the reason they did that is because when they were having riots in the prison, they said, well, here's a carrot. If you go out and you're good on the weekend, inside if you're good, we'll let you out on the weekend. But again, these are people that were never going to get out of prison. Other states were letting killers, rapists, if they were allowed to be free, maybe 2 months before their release, go find a job, go look for housing. I called people in the South, and I forget what state, whether it was in Louisiana, but I said, do you let killers and rapists out on the weekend? And they're like, no, ma'am, we hang them. It was like, they got the death penalty for these people. We're letting them out for a little shopping weekend. And we learned that Horton, that was like his 10th furlough. So it was surreal, because then Newt Gingrich just called the newsroom, and at the time, this is like 87, and we're like, who is this guy, Newt? And he wanted to get information about this story. And again, this is when there's no internet, it's hard newspaper clips. So they're calling saying, can you tell us more about this Horton and this furlough program? Of course, then that blew up because Dukakis was running against George Bush Sr., and so that became a huge issue in the campaign. And I'll never forget sitting in my North Andover living room watching the national debate, and George Bush Sr. is talking about Horton, and I'm like, that's my story. What do you, and again, if you remember, you can Google all of this, but the revolving door with Horton, he was black, he had an afro, so he was an intimidating looking character, but there's a commercial where he's revolving, and Bush was saying, Dukakis is letting killers, go through the doors and so forth, but it didn't end well for Dukakis for many reasons, but that was sure one of them. And our story, after a year of coverage, my editor, we knew it was going to be submitted for a Pulitzer. And you would think, I'd be excited about this, but I was sort of terrified. Again, the Irish side of me says, oh no. So of course, 3 o'clock that day, the editor's hand is just shaking, and I knew. I just was telling people, you better be there. You won't get any champagne. And so we won. I was 28, and it was one of the greatest things in my life, and it also was one of the most unnerving, because all of a sudden people looking at me like, you're a Pulitzer Prize winner. And I'm like, oh God. I just felt so much pressure to do that level work every single story. So when I would try to write after we won, my right arm literally feel numb to me. It was just like this reaction, and my dad was like, "Do you wish you didn't win?" I'm like, "Yeah." And so I, gradually I came to embrace that because I can say that and it gets attention. So many years later, but the Horton story taught me journalists have incredible power and responsibility. I mean, this was a law that, clearly shouldn't have been on the books, and maybe some killers and rapists were good on weekend passes and came back, and maybe it was good for some, but for people like Horton, it clearly wasn't. And they flew me out to cover his trial in Maryland, and I'm in the courtroom, and of course he was convicted by the judge there for, attempted murder, because he played chicken with the cops too as he's trying to escape and nearly killed them. So the judge, who was a classic CNN, interview many times and knew good quotes, at the end when he was sentenced in court, he said, "Tell Massachusetts, don't leave the porch light on, because Willie ain't never coming home." And I was just like, "Can you say that again?" I was like, "Let me get that right." But he was, he understood the enormity of this story. It was just nationwide. And so, of course, after Horton's convicted, my editor kept saying to me, "See if he'll talk to you. See if he'll interview you." And I'm like, "Oh." So, of course, he agreed. And that day, I'm going through multiple doors to go talk to him. And, of course, I hadn't slept. And I dreamt he was outside the hotel window. And I get there, and thankfully, we're separated by glass. And at the time, I was 28, so I was a pretty young reporter. And learned a lot on that story, and so of course, the most thing that we wanted to know is, why did you get out on furlough? You weren't a good prisoner. I mean, he was getting in fights, he was doing drugs, and so that was my first question. He got really angry, he started shouting at me, and got up to leave, and I was just like, "Oh, no, how's your family?" I was just like, turn it around, because as a reporter, I learned, through stories for most of my career, people want to trust you before they talk to you. And so clearly, asking the worst question first wasn't a good idea. But he sat down, and we talked some more, and of course, he gave me one quote that was like, "I am not a monster." And of course I'm thinking, well, I beg to differ, but that was sort of my lead in that story, because he had a different, obviously, view of himself. But before we left, I forget what else I asked, but he started screaming at me, and they took him away. So, that was the last I've seen of him. He's still in Maryland. Years later, I was 8 months pregnant, covering another story about a Maine woman who lost her son to murder in Baltimore. And I thought, I should go interview Horton. My dad was like, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And of course, my husband was in the back of the room going, "What? You're 8 months pregnant? What are you talking about?" And I didn't go because it was a hassle to get there, and I was covering another trial. But that story certainly, Horton is still in the news occasionally. But being 28, it was an eye-opening experience, because changed laws, killers and rapists don't get out in the weekend anymore in Massachusetts, and it certainly affected a national election. So I went from there to Florida. I did meet my husband. Good thing there, and I covered crime, and Florida, South Florida, as you know, Fort Lauderdale I covered the courthouse, and there were like 60 judges, and just craziness constantly. I mean, you had to pick between what murder was more interesting and more, whereas here, I mean, it's so unusual to have a murder, but down there, there was one day there were 3 people being sentenced to death, and I would just run room to room to kind of report on this. Thankfully, I never covered an execution. They used to call it Old Sparky in Florida. Those are the kind of stories that haunt you. And, as a journalist, people think the stories you tell, you're after the headlines, you're just, you go in, you go out, but, having been a journalist for 35 plus years, there are many stories where you're just haunted and never forget them, or the people you write about. In Cape Elizabeth, when we lived there briefly in the cheap section years ago, it used to be sort of a cheap section, but we would go by this huge rock on one of the main routes in Cape, and we saw this, one day it was July, and I was coming home with my daughters, and it was candles and lacrosse nets and cleats and flowers, and in the middle of the rock where kids used to spray paint, victories for lacrosse or field hockey, in loving memory of TLT. And I thought, who is TLT? Well, the next day in the paper, there's this beautiful blonde-haired boy, and he's 18, and the obituary read, died suddenly at home. And, as a journalist, typically, and there's no explanation of who died or what, it's typically suicide. Not always, but so I was haunted because I lived in that town. And the more I asked people, I learned that Timmy was like the mini mayor, and his parents had opened up town hall to explain to all the kids and all the community that Timmy died of disease. He was bipolar, and he was terrified of his future. And so he shot himself in his family home. He's one of 5 kids, and on a Saturday afternoon when they were rearranging bedrooms, moving Timmy up from the basement to the other room, he got his dad's gun and found the bullets and killed himself. And I was just like, this family's going to talk. And at the time, this was 2004, suicide was still not talked about much, but I told my editor, I said, I want to go talk to this family. I think we need to talk to this family. And they were so well known. So they agreed to talk to me, but the first night I go there, of course, when you go to do these stories, you're in knots before you even get to the door, because this is gonna be really difficult and very sensitive and just, gut-wrenching. So I get there, and of course the family's Irish too, and Nancy Thompson, who's very much a mama bear, wasn't sure about talking to me. And we're sitting in the living room surrounded by all the family portraits and Timmy. And the kind of story you have to do for these people is, my first night I was there 4 hours, and I started with, tell me about Timmy as a baby, and brought it forward. So after maybe 16, 20 hours of interviews going back to their house over and over, I was ready to tell that story. But I would go home and, with my daughters sleeping, and they were probably, Emma was probably 6 and Noah was 4, but, again, it's all individual, but you go home and you internalize it, you just think, what if? And the flip side is all that emotion, I try to put in my stories. I try to write it as if this is my family member. And, people would say, we always cry when we read your stories. And I said, well, you should. This is really sad. And oftentimes things need to be done. Maine at the time had one of the highest teen suicide rates. So I did a side story about, lock your guns up. The poor father, he said to me, do you have to say that was a gun, that was our gun? And I said, yes, because families need to know. He hid the bullets in his sock drawer, the gun was elsewhere, but kids know everything. And so, it's sort of like that public service, like, it could happen to you, and more talking, but things like that. I covered homeless teens in Maine that had mental health issues that couldn't get help. I spent times in motel rooms with families that didn't have a place. Mother and daughter were bipolar, and the 14-year-old, they're just in this little hotel room, and she would go in the bathroom and shut the door. So I followed her to see what was going on. Well, she would go in there to play with her Polly Pocket dollhouse. And she said, one day I hope to have a doll, like a house like this. That was her imaginary house. And she would shut the door and not hear her screaming. But all these stories, and I still think of them, I wonder where they are and what happened to this family. But as you kind of move on to your stories, you feel like, my daughters are always saying, why do you write about these things that are so sad? And I'd be like, because, people will read it and they will do things. People will help. Whether it's the mental health system or, some of the alcoholism in Maine where, you probably all remember too, where that guy was drinking his coffee-flavored brandy and driving down the highway and ended up killing people at the toll booth. I spent a year writing about alcohol abuse in Maine and the devastating effects on families and, who lose dads. So there's plenty of those stories. I promise I'd make you laugh. There was a story. I know, I'm like, all right, we gotta move on from the suicides, all right. But there's things like, in Florida where anything can happen. I remember covering, because I covered courthouse, this family, I think they're Italian, but of course they're all fighting. And, I shouldn't say that, being Irish, I'm like, the Irish fight funny. But it was an Italian family, and they were all fighting with each other, they couldn't agree on anything. So suddenly the body disappears. Like one member of the family stole the body. And they're like, I'm not giving it back to you, agree to do whatever. But it was just like, comedy. It was like, where's the body? And the funeral director, I don't know. But it was crazy. And there was another story, it was May '88, so soon after the Horton stuff, Jackie McDermott in Lowell was shot. And he was an informant that was working with the FBI, I think, or state police. And he was ratting on the Windsor Hill gang. So Jackie McDermott got shot, and of course my editor said, go to the wake, see if you can see who's there, interview a few people. So this is like, I said, sure. So my grandfather, sure, why not? I just interviewed Horton, he didn't do anything to me. So my mother's father, who was a character, lived in Lowell, and I said, Grandpa, meet me at McDonough's funeral home. And so he shows up on his bike with his little dog in the basket and his pipe. And I'm like, all right, do you recognize any of these people? And of course, there's a lot of black, dark cars. So I got my notebook and I'm like, starting to take the license plate down. And this big guy gets out and says, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm just here from the Eagle Tribune. And he just threatened me and said, don't come back here. So of course, I go to my sister Jackie's house in Chelmsford and I'm like, I need another outfit. I gotta look different. I gotta look a little different. So she's like, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm gonna go to the evening showing and see if I can see anybody else or see who's on the guest book. And so they're all like, yeah, great. So I get in line at the evening showing. There's a long line, so I finally get in. And of course, I get up to the guest book, and I'm like trying to flip through pages. Anybody would write their name that was like a mobster, maybe they would. But the big guy sees me, and I'm like, oh shit. So he comes up to me, and another guy comes up to me, and literally picked me up and dragged me to the side door. And they didn't throw me down the stairs, but they weren't gentle, and he said, don't come back again. And that time I figured out, I'm not going back. But I wrote about it, I was like, my editor said, that's good stuff, write about that. And so I got the story, I didn't get killed. But there are many stories where, journalists, sometimes they cross the line, but I think most of the time you're trying to be respectful, you're trying to tell the story, you're trying to be fair. There's only one story in Florida that I remember, I was just haunted because they would always send me, if somebody died, they thought, I could get somebody to talk. And, I was called Angel of Death. I was like, great, I'm going to talk to people that just lost someone, that died. So this one woman, her daughter killed herself, and the reason it was a story is because the daughter's stepdad was a sheriff in Florida, and she, in her letter, said, he abused me. So we're like, oh. And of course it's competitive, you got a lot of papers, and they said, okay, you go to the door, and it's the day of the wake, and see what you can get. And I'm like, okay, good. And again, I'm like, I get lost easily, and I was just praying I would never find a place, but I showed up, knocked on the door, and the mom of the daughter looked at me. And I said, I'm here from the Sun Sentinel, and I'm sorry to be here at this moment, but because of that letter, we're just trying to, talk to you. And she just looked at me and said, I'm about to wake my daughter. What do you want? I said, nothing. And I that's one of the rare moments in my career that I just felt like I was going to throw up, in the sense of I didn't want to be there. And of course my editor said, go there, but that's one of the moments I wish I could take back and, say, we don't have to go today. If we get beat on the story, that's okay. But, I want to be human. I want to look at the person I'm interviewing as if they're one of my sisters, my mother, my daughters. To me, it's like be a human being first and treat that person like you would want to be treated, or my mother. But after, many years of reporting, saw The Perfect Storm, and that movie resonated, I think, partly because, the Irish, the water, I'm always connected to the water. And my dad, we were in Cape Elizabeth, and I said, I want to write books, because I've been working on year-long projects. I was writing books in effect with paper, and I was ready to switch it up, and I said, I want to write books. He said, what kind? And I said, sort of like The Perfect Storm. And he said, you have a story like that in your family. So he starts telling me a story he never told anybody, about Captain Patty, who was his great uncle in Newfoundland. And Patty, all my dad knew was that his father, my dad's father was Ambrose, also from Newfoundland. The story that had passed on to him. And Cat and Patty was out in the 1935 gale off Newfoundland's coast, and that many of these ancestors had died. You know, Patty may have been lashed to the mast, and he didn't know much more, but I said, well, that sounds interesting. And then my dad says, maybe we can get in touch with family. And I'm thinking, family? Because Ambrose had abandoned my dad, my nan, and my uncle twice. And my dad refused to speak his name. And, you know, until I was 18, I thought Ambrose was dead. He was in California with another family. So my dad's saying we can get in touch with family, and I'm like, wow, Ambrose's family. I know nothing about them. But this leads to 9 years of research and reporting. And my dad, my younger sister Joni, one of the twins, you know, told my dad, because I'm researching and I'm calling all these people in Newfoundland, I'm trying to get things. And I said, Dad, we got to go to Newfoundland. These people are in the 80s and 90s, and there was a whole lot of shouting going on, and they were like, just like, what? So we said, Dad, we've got to go to Newfoundland. And he's like, have a nice trip, because he's not going where his father was born. But then I say, I need to go there for the book. And he agrees. And so we go to Newfoundland June, let's say 2000, I should remember these things, 2003 or 4. And we're on a little plane for Boston, which, you know, those small things where you think, you know, God help us. And we see the rock in the distance, and I'm sitting next to my dad, and he's been sighing the whole trip. And I know he'd just turn this plane around if he could. And I said, Dad, you ever think you'd be going to Newfoundland? He said, not in a million years. And I'm thinking, oh God, you know, this is going to be horrible. It wasn't. I mean, I was able to interview all these people, like in their 80s and 90s, who their dads died in the storm. And, you know, there's a crazy, I don't want to give the book away, a crazy scene, of course, about a wake and a mismatched body and all these things. But I went there 3 times to interview people because, again, the Irish Newfoundlanders, they didn't want to tell me bad things about my relatives. But that's what you want. You want the real stories. So Cat and Patty, during storms, would climb to the top of the mast and shout, I'm not afraid of you. And all the other Irish Catholics who are throwing holy water and palm fronds into the water and making crosses to calm the waves are like, Patty, get down, please. But Patty was legendary, and so this August gale, after going there 3 times, interviewing hundreds of people, you know, I was able to recreate this storm because, you know, if somebody wasn't alive then, the stories were told over and over and over. You know, stories about the night before the gale. Captain Patty was going out in his schooner with his 2 sons, Frankie and Jerome. And Frankie was 12, terrified of the sea. He used to get seasick. Jerome loved the sea. He was 14. And the other schooner from Marystown, this small village where they grew up, had his son James, and that was his first time captaining a schooner, and he had a crew of 4. So Lillian, you know, the wife who knows her 3 sons are going out, and Patty, and it's the August gale season, the hurricane season, and she begs them, you know, don't go. They're sitting in the kitchen table having a cup of tea the night before he's leaving, and a whirlwind of dirt hits the windows, and she's convinced, Patty, you can't go. And then she goes out and sees a lone black cloud in the sky, and she's like, please, Patty, don't go. Of course, he waits a night and goes, but I won't give it away, but the storm is roaring up the coast, and within days, you know, it strikes, and 42 children in Marystown left without their fathers. So it was a very emotional story, and the flip side, I didn't want to include Ambrose because all my dad's, you know, most of his life, he was 68 when we went to Newfoundland. He didn't want to talk about him, and I'm thinking, I don't want him in my book. I can't do it. But then it was like he was pushing in. So I said, Dad, I have to write about Ambrose too. And he said, it's okay, I trust you. And I'm thinking, oh God, I'm a reporter, and then I'm a daughter, I'm a reporter. So for 9 years, you know, the way this is, it alternates in time with learning about my grandfather and then the Newfoundland, you know, going back and forth in 1935. So my dad, who was an avid reader, you know, I would send him chapters 1, 3, 5, and 7 because he's like, what's going on? Where's the rest of them? I said, you're not reading those till I'm done because I would never finish the Ambrose chapters. And the day my sister, you know, I mailed it to him in New Hampshire, and I said to my sister, check on him. And she said, well, he's halfway through, he loves it. I said, oh God. So then he calls me at 5, and he says, well, I got a few things. And he says, Aunt Ruth isn't there. You got to get her. She'll be rolling over in the grave. When they came back from California with me, and she took them in. And Uncle Tommy helped them while they were in California. You got to get him in. I said, okay. And that was it. And I said, Dad, that's it. You know, it was just stunning to me because there's scenes in here, if you've read it, they're very private and painful for my dad, and he wasn't going to make me take those out. And so this book was a huge gift from him. And there's 2 chapters I usually read, and I'll briefly kind of get into books and my Jamie Wilde stories. But in this scene, you know, this was the first time that I went with my dad and my sister, and we would interview people, and everybody kept saying, go interview Michael Farrell. And, you know, I knew, I'm like, something's not right with this. And Michael Farrell was one of the sons whose father was lost. And, you know, it was just an odd contrast because my dad lost his father in a different way. And so it was interesting to be in that kitchen with this man who's so still grief-stricken, and my father's kind of buried pain that didn't come out for many years. But I'm just going to read this passage when we were, you know, in Marystown, ready to go to Michael Farrell's home. As we drive along the quiet and curvy roads from Gertrude's Little Bay home back to Marystown, I replay the comments about Ambrose in my mind. Are our relatives saying kind words about my grandfather to make us feel welcome? Like my father's half-sisters, Donnie and Kathy, our Newfoundland kin saw the good in my grandfather. He was well-loved, well-liked. Would I have liked him? Would I have found him charming, enjoyed his stories? Would I have forgiven him for deserting my dad? Winding past the cluster of houses along Reed Hill, we look for the home of Michael Farrell, whose father crewed for James Walsh on the Mary Bernice. A short distance from Patty's home, we spot the small white house that sits along the bay. A bachelor who lives alone, Farrell has been waiting for our arrival. A thin, dark-haired man, he welcomes us from his doorstep. God bless ye, come in, he hollers. Cats, nearly a dozen of them, roam the road. A few scurry inside the house. Not fond of felines, Joni heads it back to the car, explaining that she will pick us up later. My father and I follow Farrell inside, where he pulls kitchen chairs out for us. In the dimly lit room, Farrell begins to talk. The words tumble from his mouth quickly. He is excited to share his stories, but his Newfoundland accent is thick, almost incomprehensible. I glance at my father's eyes, and I know he is thinking, oh, brother. Still, Farrell has something to say, and we want to understand him. Our conversation evolves into odd charade. Farrell speaks a few sentences, and my father and I try to select words that we recognize and repeat them back. This goes on for 10 minutes before we figure out that Farrell was a year old at the time of the storm. He had 3 older siblings, and his mother's name was Victoria. Farrell begins to talk about the night of the gale, and my father and I lean forward. The wind, Farrell tells us, repeating the word again before we have the chance to do so. The wind was fierce that night. My gosh, the old people thought the roof was going to blow off. Farrell says something about his mother, explaining that she saw a token. Token? My father and I asked. Unfamiliar with this word that we will later learn means a vision, a portent of death. Ignoring our question, Farrell continues his story, and we discern the words hallway and boots. We utter the words back to him, and Farrell patiently tells us the story again, this time slowly. The night of the gale, his mother heard noises in her second-floor hallway. Me mother could hear someone walking in the hall, he tells us. She got up from her bed and saw me father in his oilskins and boots. He was walking back and forth. Your mother saw his spirit, I asked? Farrell nods. She kept shouting his name, but he would not answer. He just kept pacing the floorboards. She knew then my poor daddy was lost. Barely a toddler at the time of the gale, Farrell has no memory of the father he was named after. He cannot recall his father's voice, his face, his dad's large calloused hands. All I knew when I was a boy that my poor daddy was lost, drowned, gone forever. I used to feel terrible about it. I wish I knew what happened, how he went. Farrell falls silent, and my father and I are quiet too. From the window, I see Joni pull into the driveway. Knowing we have garnered as much as possible from Pharaoh, I stand telling him, thanks for talking with us. I am sorry about your father. He shakes our hands, appreciative that we listen to his stories. As we head out the door, he bids us another, God bless you. I smile at Pharaoh and return his blessing. My father, who like Joni is not fond of cats, walks quickly to the car. Pharaoh continues to wave goodbye, and I sense his sadness, a son lonely for his father. 68 years after the gale, his sorrow lingers. His words echo in my head. All I knew was that my poor daddy was lost. I follow in my father's footsteps, taking in the sight of his back, the broad shoulders that have carried his own loss for much of his life. As he slips into the passenger seat, I wonder which is worse, to have no memories of your dad before he vanishes in a roiling sea, or to be deserted on a cold November night by a father who is your hero, your idol for the first 11 years of your life. So sometimes I cry during that one. There's passages I can't read in this book that I would start sobbing. But the other passage, which, as I wrote this book, and if you read it, it goes back and forth in time. And it was funny because once I got the contract from a publisher, I had a deadline. And I was like scared to death. And my daughter Nora, who was very emotional and sensitive like her mama, and an Irish fancy too, she created a little writing family of stuffed animals and put it by my desk and said, they'll help you. And I was like, okay, I can do this. But again, the deadline, I worked every day and didn't answer phones and just tried to move forward. But strangely, I wrote this chronologically. I did rewrite the first chapter probably 100 times because I didn't have a contract then, so it was like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Because for me, I'll rewrite until you grab it out of my hands, and that's good and bad. But the other passage I just want to read is when Captain Patty is out in the storm, and many people will ask me, well, you weren't there, obviously. I wasn't with Captain Patty in the dory out there. But after interviewing like 300 people, I knew, Patty's personality. And I was able to get firsthand stories from either people who were alive or people that had, the story had passed on and on. Again, there's a great scene about the wake that I won't share, but Patty, when I would visit my Newfoundland relatives, they were big on the radio, like CBC, and they'd be like, you need to go on there and talk about out of scale and get people to give you stories. So I'm like, I'm not doing that. And they're like, you're on in 5 minutes, they give me a glass of wine, shut the door, and within minutes of talking, saying I was looking for information, people are calling, including one who may have been the last one to see Patty and his sons the night before the gale. They're rowing in to get water. And, his boys were playing on the beach, and, it was just incredible. I was just able to piece together this story. But obviously, with the dialogue, there's a scene I'm trying to find. I usually, mark this, but with the dialogue, you've got to create dialogue for a book. And again, I wasn't there, but I was able to say, all right, I know Patty would be terrified for his sons, and I also know he'd be really angry at God. So again, sorry, I'm trying to find this. You're saying, Mark, that bad on me. Anyway, I might skip this because it's dark and I'm having trouble there. All right, you might have to just read it in the book. Sorry, but it is a scene. Yeah, it's a great scene with Patty out in the dory, and again, I'd love to read it to you next time. But when you read these things in the book, people might say, well, Barbara, how could you know? But I know Patty would be cursing God. I know he would be thinking, oh, my wife Lillian is going to lose 3 sons and a husband. And the grief for that village. There's other great stories about Father McGettigan, who was the priest. And there are many stories about him, including what he did to his dog, Jocko. And I would say, and before I would take it as truth, I would get it independently from like 2 or 3 different people, which is sort of as a journalist, you hear something, you're like, you try to find it out from somebody else without tipping your hat about it. But there are many things in this book that, again, the movie, we're always trying to get the movie made. I've written a script, but if anybody knows screenwriters, I'm not a screenwriter. So I'm trying to, before I finish like a chapter, my sisters and my dad was like, well, who's going to play me? You know, so it was kind of evolved from, I haven't written anything yet, but they had a lot of faith in me. So if you read it, it's a very visual, dramatic book. But from that same year, October of 2012, this came out in August. So Sammy the Sky is also a true story about our dog Sammy. It was my husband's dog who had approved me first before we could date. And Sammy was our family's first dog, and this story is about when Sammy was dying, and my daughter Emma, who's now 25, and Nora's 22, they were like 3 and 5 as he's dying, and of course, they kept saying things like, you know, what does die? You know, what does that mean? Where do you go? And so it was just constant questions, and as you can see, Jamie Wyatt's art is just stunning. And the way I was writing this story at the time, this came out again in 2011, agents were like, it's too sad, it's too real, it won't sell. And I kept saying to my daughters, it'll be in a bookstore one day. And so finally, you know, a friend says, well, Barbara, call Jamie Wyatt. I'm like, are you crazy? She's like, he loves dogs. I said, oh, all right. So I call him, and of course, he answers the phone, and I'm like, oh no, Jamie? He says, yes. I'm like, oh, it's Barbara. I have a children's book I'd like you to read. And he's like, okay, send it along. I went to Tennis Harbor. And the first version of this book ended in a true way. We cremated Sammy, threw the ashes in a field where he ran. But it was windy, and they sort of blew back on Nora. So that was the first ending. And, my friends are like, I want to change that. So I reworked it to, they would always see Sammy in the clouds. And, the memory is always there because kids can say, there's Sammy. And rewrote it, sent it to Jamie. And I was in Toronto coming back from Newfoundland research. And of course, my husband, he says, don't yell at me. Not that I ever do, right? And an envelope came to the house with Wolfman Frankenstein stamps and calligraphy. And it's from Jamie. So he's reading it to me while I'm in, the airport in Toronto researching August Gale. And he says, Jamie says you'd like to do your book. Do you want color or black and white illustration? So I'm like, woo! Like going nuts in the Toronto airport. So I get home, and of course, I say to Jamie, all right, we gotta meet. We gotta talk about this and figure out how to move forward. So I go up to his Tennis Harbor home, one of his homes off the island where he rows in sometimes. But, of course, again, very nervous, and get to the barn where his assistant brings me down, and, she's showing me all the art and family portraits, and there's Rockwell Kent, there's N.C. Wyatt, Andrew Wyatt, millions and millions of worth of art on the walls. And then she shows me a painting. Jamie was starting his Gull series, and it was like Mother, I think the page was called Mother, and, it was like a mother and a baby gull. And she said, God, you just finished that. I'm like, wow, I just get to see that myself from the first one. So she leaves me, and I'm waiting, and I turn in the room, and it wasn't a very big room. It was a dark kind of room. So in this corner, I see a terrier sitting on the top of the stepladder. I'm like, oh, you're a really well-behaved terrier. And I get closer and realize it's a dead stuffed terrier. And I'm like, okay, time to sit down now. So I sit in front of the fire, and Jamie comes in with his, his mismatched socks and his knickers, and he's dressed like his grandfather. And we get chatting and talking about how we end the book, and we need an agent. And finally I say, what's up with the dead stuffed dog? And he said, me and my buddy Andy Warhol used to roam in New York City, and they found some shops that had dead stuffed animals. And one of them was, Jamie likes terriers. And so Halloween, he has a couple of dead stuffed cats that get put outside the door too. So if people say kitty, they get a shock because the kitty's stuffed, So the whole process of this book, though, was amazing because it was my first children's book, and I didn't know what illustrators do, but obviously you can see if you flip through this book later, Jamie's art, and he's also a dog lover. I mean, it's just stunning. And this book, though it's sad, though it's real about losing someone you love, it also helps kids and adults process because Sammy was always going to be in the clouds and always with And so the book now is, I've spoken to hospice is using it to kind of help kids process deaths, which is great. And it's like a legacy, you know, for Eric, my husband, and my daughters. It's like, you know, it's a true story, but again, you know, sometimes your stories can help others, you know, no matter what they are. And that's what I've always believed is like, you know, when I hear a story, I want to write it or tell it, because I think there's a reason to share it. And, you know, we all may have different backgrounds, but, you know, even with your own families, people tend not to want to write about, you know, the bad things. But when those stories go, you know, with your mother, with your grandmother, with your father, they're gone. You know, I wouldn't have known anything about my influential relatives. And it's amazing because, you know, they're incredible people, and, you know, it's such a gift. I'm just going to briefly chat about the other books, and we can do Q&A, and I will have books. Christmas is coming, holidays, grandkids, but this you all should recognize too. This is my recent one. She's 103 now, and Jenny is just amazing. She's just, you know, still getting around, still laughing, never complaining, and although she's started to kind of use a walker now, she's still one of the most inspirational people I know, and she's been lobstering since she was 8 years old. So this is my newest, and I have several other, mostly true stories, because that's what I like to focus on, extraordinary people in Maine. Yeah, I will be quiet now, and I know for 5 minutes, right?